Welcome everyone. Good to see familiar faces again. Tonight we are embarking upon our 2-week session on C.S. Lewis, and this is really exciting for me. Just to recap, we started our sessions off with George MacDonald, who C.S. Lewis actually regarded as his master, and if you'll remember, said that he believed MacDonald portrayed the character of Christ better than anyone he had ever read, which is high praise. So we talked about George MacDonald and especially the way he sees analogies between nature and the spiritual life. And then last week we did G.K. Chesterton, who's a fun British clever intellectual, and he was also extremely influential in the Inklings group. And this week we're actually starting one of the members of the actual Inklings groups. The two that we've already talked about were sort of their forerunners and influences. So they're the pre-Inklings. Nice. I like that. I'll use that. That's good. So, and as I said in the first lecture, the Inklings, they were started by an undergrad film major, someone random whose name I don't even know if we know, poor guy. But it started Lewis and Tolkien and some of the others, Charles Williams, meeting together every week to share the things that they were reading, the things they were writing, and giving each other courage to publish some of the things that they wrote that they didn't think the world wanted or needed. And so I think that that's just an encouragement to us to seek out that kind of intellectual, spiritual community, to keep our passions and our minds active, and to give us courage to give to the world the things that are going on in our own lives that maybe we can bless others with that we didn't realize we could. So Lewis is, for me, of all of the thinkers I'll be talking about, the one that I encountered first in my own life. I remember reading the Narnia books as a child, or they were read to me, which is even better in certain ways, by my dad. And I'm actually reading them now for the second time through to my daughters. And my younger daughter, Annalise, she's really enjoying them in a fuller way than she did the first time, because she was kind of young. And so she's actually decided she's having a Narnia birthday party in 2 weeks. So we'll all dress up like characters from Narnia and have swords, and it will be lots of fun. So, but one of the things that I appreciate about Lewis is, first of all, he was someone that I could read and encounter as a teenager. And he's someone that I actually give to my students whose minds are active and who are questioning and who are starting to just wonder about life in the world. And I remember I read The Great Divorce in 7th grade with the Young Life leader. We met during lunch, and that expanded my mind so much, and it was such an exciting encounter. And it was kind of like waking up in a certain sense and not feeling alone. And then in high school, I read some more of his works, and it's interesting because I encountered Lewis at the same time I encountered Francis Schaeffer, who you guys may be familiar with, and he's also a very well-regarded writer on the integration of reason and faith and the Christian life, and he's great. And they both influenced me in high school and led me to then become a philosophy major in college. What's interesting is that over time, going to college, studying philosophy, reading through the great books of the Western tradition, some from the East, I came back to those two authors later on in my late 20s, mid to late 20s, and what I found, which is just, it's interesting, and this isn't to Schaeffer's discredit, but I found Lewis to still be so careful. So after all that I had read from Plato and Aristotle and Kant and Nietzsche, he seemed to still always be careful in the claims he was making, the distinctions he was making. It still seemed like, for the most part, when he spoke about an author believing such and such, that yes, he had read the author and had read them carefully and was giving them a charitable interpretation. I didn't find that to be as true consistently with Schaeffer, so it was a little bit of a disappointing return when I read Schaeffer again. I still recommend him to people. I still think that he did really important work. I think that though it does speak to something that Lewis is really good at, which is just that he wrote for a popular audience, but he was so careful in such a way that an academic could read him and be aware that he was not sort of making these reductionistic claims. He was being careful with everything he said, and so you can go get a PhD in philosophy and read him again and still sort of be impressed and pleasantly surprised. And just like any good book, you return to it again and again and again, and it's new things alight on the page, and I think that that's definitely true with Lewis. I do tonight want to recommend a few books of his, and next week, which we're going to focus primarily next week on the Narnia series. So this week I'm talking a little bit more about his nonfiction. So there is a book recommendation list that John has printed out over here from all of the Inklings. I just want to mention 3 tonight, and a fourth that's an essay. So Surprised by Joy. I don't know. Raise your hand if you've read Surprised by Joy. Okay. It is in certain ways his autobiography. It's somewhat like the Confessions, what the Confessions were for Augustine. It tells the journey of his early life and how he came upon Christianity and what led to his conversion. And it's a fascinating read. The first time I read it, it didn't delight me as much as the second time I read it, and then the third time was even better. And I don't know if it's just because I'm older and so I can appreciate some of the experiences he was describing that now seem to resonate. Whereas a child, I was like, well, where are the magic lions? That's what I want. Tonight, a lot of the quotations that we're going to read and discuss are from this book, especially his concept of joy. So I highly recommend it, and I also recommend, if you don't like it the first time, giving it another try, a second or a third. Also, Till We Have Faces, A Myth Retold. Raise your hand if you've read this one. So a lot of literary types tend to think of this as his best work. They tend to think of it as the most beautifully written, and it has a sort of mythos character to it that just gives it this otherworldly feel. And what he does is he takes the old myth of Psyche and Eros, and he retells it in its own form, and he keeps a lot of the elements of the story, but he puts a sort of Christian spin on it. I read it actually for the first time this summer in like 2 days. I couldn't really put it down, and it's a complicated book. I think like a lot of the imagery takes a little while to sink in, and so this one, maybe like Surprised by Joy, you'll read the first time and you'll enjoy it as a story, but I think all the things he's doing only start to become apparent as you go back and you read certain sections and you see, oh, this symbolizes this, and this is sort of pointing to this other thing. But it's fantastic. I highly recommend it. It's sort of like a fairy tale for adults. I don't know if I would give it to my kids yet. I think it's definitely, though, teenage and up, fantastic read. The other one, and I don't usually like books like this, but it is called Yours, Jack, and it is just a collection of C.S. Lewis's letters. He was really well known for how much he responded to the letters that were written to him. He got mail almost every day from people, atheists, agnostics, Christians, that were asking his opinion on certain intellectual questions, on questions about the spiritual life. And so the editor of this book there's so many letters that I think that the full set is like 3 volumes long. So this is actually only choosing all of the ones that pertain to the spiritual life. basically. And they're just fantastic. I mean, I found some of the best passages that I've ever read in Lewis in this collection, and none of them show up in any of his books. They're just in letters written to people. So it's called Yours, Jack, which is how he signs his letters. And it's really interesting because they give it in chronological order, so you also see some of these letters are about the spiritual life, but they're before he became a Christian. Some are right after his conversion. Some are later on, and it's just really, really well put together, and you can sort of take your time through it. I just highly recommend it. I was rereading it this past week, and I was like, I need to sit down and just go through the whole thing again. So those are a few book recommendations, and maybe I shouldn't move on before just saying this is actually my favorite Lewis book. It's called The Four Loves, and I wanted to just make my talk about it tonight and figure out a way to say that it's about the imagination, but it's really not. So I for a while I convinced myself that I could sort of maneuver around and make the talk about my favorite book, but it would actually be really insincere and deceptive. So I decided not to, but I can still tell you that it's worth reading. And he takes 4 types of love and unpacks what they are. It's storge, which is familial love, and then it's friendship love, eros, and then caritas, which is the Christian form of love, and how that actually sort of transforms and redefines the meaning of the 3 other loves. So he's just he has a lot of really good psychological and spiritual insights about the way people relate to one another. Yes.
Is that your favorite book, period? Or?
No, it's not. It's not. My favorite book, period, besides the Bible is Augustine's Confessions. So that has this very high place in my heart. So no book has knocked it off the shelf yet. A few have come very close, but this is up there as far as maybe top 10 for sure. It's called The Four Loves, and I actually use it to teach when I taught at HCC ethics. I used it to teach the students, and for the most part they were not Christians and they loved it. So it's also a really great book to read with a non-believer and just talk about the general way we love each other. So I think that's one of the things that makes Lewis so great. So really quick, Lewis's life, just before we get started on his view of the imagination. John has some of the details up here. He was born in 1898. So one of the ways you can always know how old he was is by taking the year, so 1946, and just minusing 2 years. That's how old C.S. Lewis was at the time. So 1945, he was 43. So that's a nice way to sort of just remember, or the other way, 40, yeah, okay, right, yeah. Math, not my strong suit. Yeah, just embarrass myself. Okay, so anyway, he was born in Ireland. Something I found out that I actually didn't know recently is that he was very loyal to his Irish heritage. So he grew up in Ireland and was raised there, and then often longed for it when he was back in England. And he was almost in despair when he saw the English countryside compared to the Irish countryside. He just thought there was no comparison between the two. So that's something that sort of is strong in his thought. He grew up with one brother, and he lived in a home where stories and books were extremely important. He and his brother often read books together and also created imaginative worlds together. So it's really fun for me to read some of the stories because it reminds me a lot of my daughters, just the way that they play. But all of the books they were reading ended up being integrated in the way that they created these worlds and the kind of pretend play that they would do, and so they were either reading or making forts outside. Basically, that was kind of what his childhood consisted of. And his father was kind of eccentric and distant. His mother was much closer to him, and he actually, it was tragically, she died when he was young. So that ended up being a pretty hard and an influential event in his life. A lot of, I think what he likes about MacDonald is MacDonald has often feminine allegories for God. Just feminine characters that are maternal and motherly, and they come and comfort the character that's lost or in despair, and that's meant to point to Christ. And I think that often appealed to Lewis because she was the source of comfort that he had lost at an early age. And his father didn't really take up the mantle much in really sort of helping his sons through that grief process. His dad in certain ways fell apart because of losing her, and so they were estranged from him and sent off to boarding school, and he hated boarding school. Some of his stories in Surprised by Joy, you think of a really miserable, alienated child, maybe being bullied a lot. He didn't like sports, which it just sort of kills your social status as a boy at a boarding school. He wasn't super competitive. He wanted to read and talk about stories and write, and this was like a very fraternity-ish type of school. So socially he struggled. He also just didn't enjoy the competitive nature of the way people related to one another, and so that was a hard time in his life. He was actually confirmed in the Anglican Church sort of early, and he remembers actually feeling very deceptive about it. He remembers that he knew at the time he was agreeing to something for social status, but he didn't actually believe it. So he was a firm atheist by the age of 15, but I think even before that he remembers knowing that he was going through the motions and not really doing what he believed, and regretted it later. He also, another thing that I think that's just interesting is that when his mother died, he sat down and determined to pray. When she was dying, he sat down and determined to pray for her all night, with the belief that if I really have faith in God now, and if I really pray and I really ask him and I pray all night long, then surely he will heal her. And it was like the moment maybe in his life that he had felt closest to God, kind of. And then she dies, very shortly after this sort of full night of prayer. And that makes him extremely bitter about God. He said that as an atheist, it wasn't that he didn't think about God, it was that he thought about God all the time and was mad that God didn't exist. So I think that sort of shows some of the influences behind sort of his strong atheism at an early age. So at a certain point he leaves boarding school. He gets privately tutored by a man by the name, I think, of Kirkpatrick, who was extremely logical and rational, and helped Lewis sort of fine-tune his argumentative skills. So just helped him be precise in his language and what he claimed. Always challenged almost everything he said. I think when Lewis first met him, he just said, the weather's nice today, and his tutor was like, how do you know what the weather is like? What do you mean by the word nice? And like he got in this long argument, and he had to defend, and he's like, I cannot do small talk with this man, obviously. This man also disdained faith and religion, so that sort of bolstered his atheism at the time. And so then he goes off to study at Oxford. He is enlisted in the army in World War I for a while, and has really hard experiences. A lot of the tragedies that he sees make him upset with God, upset that God allows these sorts of things to happen. One of his best friends passes away in the army, and before he dies, they agree that if one of them dies, they will take care of the other person's parent. So this friend said that if Lewis died, he would take care of his father until his father passed away. If his friend died, he would take care of his mother till she passed away. And his friend does die. So Lewis returns home from fighting in the army and buys a house for her, sets up a room next to her, and takes care of her until she dies, and actually calls her mother. So there's something really beautiful about that, that he was able to sort of, in certain ways, reclaim some of the things that he had lost from his own mother. So he did that. And he studied at Oxford, and there was a point at which he started to get in debates with Tolkien, some of the other Inklings, and found the atheists that he was encountering to have a very small view of the world. It sounds kind of like what Chesterton also found, that they didn't, that their version of the world, he even said, even if it's true, seemed extremely disappointing and boring, and a reason for despair to a certain extent. And all of the authors he loved were Christian authors. In fact, I have a quote on your handout. I think it's not. No, it's actually. Is it? No, I have it actually. I'll read it to you. This is just his experience with, let's see if I can find it. I may, you know what, I'll return to it later. But he says basically that all of the things that his imagination longed for, he found being described in the Christian authors, and so had this sort of this thing where reason was on one side and imagination was on the other, and he wasn't sure how to get it together. And so he has these conversations with Tolkien. He converts, and it's interesting. They talk all night, and then the next day he takes a trip to the zoo, and he says that when he left on his bike, he didn't believe in God, and when he arrived at the zoo, he did. And so and he says, like, it wasn't like this momentous, like, intellectual moment in like a debate with Tolkien, although it was following the night of conversation that they had together. So he said, though, that once he did, it was like he couldn't unbelieve. There's no way for him to think otherwise. And but he did say that of all of England, he probably was the one that kicked and screamed against it the most before he did. And he was 32 when he did become a Christian. And his Christianity really stuck. You can see in his letters just that he devoured as many Christian authors as he could, and I think that he was just really struggling and trying to change the patterns of his life and the patterns of his thinking that had been so unchristian and so detrimental to his own soul. And so he reads the mystics, he reads people that talk about the spiritual life, he reads things on intellectual questions because he's constantly having debatings at Oxford, and just sort of, I think that there's this thing that I love about certain people, the way they devour books. It's because life is hard and they're trying to figure out how to exist. It's not just I'm going to read for pleasure or I'm going to just read to get facts. But for him, I think he devoured books at this point because he needed help. He didn't know exactly what to do, so he was going to read the Bible as much as he could, but he was going to also read all these Christian intellectuals. And so he's been a bridge for me to a lot of other thinkers that I didn't know about because he discovered them, and then I go to them. So Thomas Kempis is one, Imitation of Christ, which he loved, and it was because I found out Lewis had read him that I read him, and found him to be like fantastically helpful for like struggling through being a Christian in this life. So he did all the things that you need to do to keep your passion stirred and keep yourself awake. And so anyway, he taught at Oxford. He was broadcast on the BBC. We actually still have a lot of his talks in his own voice, which is great. And then meets Joy Davidson later on in his life, and she is an American. She's the smartest woman that he's ever met, and sort of feels like his equal in terms of the ability to keep up with his mind, and also just kind of fearless in her personality. Tolkien did not like her at all. He was very much opposed to them being friends, and then later them getting married. She had 2 sons. She had divorced an alcoholic, sort of abusive husband, and so she converted. I think in her conversation, she was an atheist previously, so she converted through her conversations with Lewis. So they got married, and she came down with cancer and died of cancer 4 years later. So he finds the woman that he finally falls in love with late in life. They get married, and they have this really, in certain ways, fantastic 4 years. They were hard 4 years too, because there were certain times where she was struggling, but she went into remission for a while, so they thought, oh, this is over, and then it returned, and she did die. And that's when he sort of plunges just down. He doesn't lose his faith, but it's actually when he writes one of his most striking works, which is called A Grief Observed, and it's just him struggling and wrestling with God, and writing sort of his raw emotions, and it's all his journal entries. It's not even a book that he necessarily initially intended to be published. And it's funny because when he did publish it, he published it under a pseudonym because he didn't want anyone to know that this was about him and his wife that had died. And his friends, when he was going through grief, would recommend the book to him. They're like, you would love this book. You should read it. It will help you deal with your grief. And he was like, really, it's just really interesting. And I read that one actually for the first time in the past year, and it's just fantastic. So another one that I highly recommend. And then he taught at Cambridge for a little while at the very end of his life. Still returned to Oxford every weekend. That was kind of his home. And then passed away. Do you have the date there? Died on 1963. Yeah. Yes. So that's sort of an overview of his life. I wanted to go into a little detail because I think a lot of he's someone who he let the personal struggles that he had influence his work so much, and so I think that his life is important in understanding his view of the imagination. So if
forever referred to as Jack. The Screwtape Letters, a phenomenal book, is actually dedicated to Tolkien. And Tolkien patterned the character Gollum a little bit after C.S. Lewis, who apparently always had an annoying cough.
I did not know that. Wow.
C.S. Lewis has kind of been dubbed the apostle to the skeptics, and those of us who are skeptics, much like his character Puddleglum in the Chronicles of Narnia, owe a lot to him. One of the things I find most encouraging about his life is that he struggled greatly. He thought deeply, and the way he, I think, most drastically impacted the rest of the world was through his hobby. I mean, he did not get paid to write Christian apologetics. He was a English professor at a fantastic university, but that is not how we know his name today. His colleagues really didn't regard his children's literature as much, and they kind of came up against him as most of his publications were for laymen, and that really hurt the ability to promote, and that had something to do with him going over to Cambridge from Oxford because he, I believe, wasn't getting promoted. So I find that encouraging. Doing art in my spare time and things like this, I think we can still have we can have a lasting the impact of work is not the most important thing. So
that's fantastic. I'm also inspired by. So I used to be a college professor, and I love philosophy. I love reading secondary literature on Kierkegaard and footnotes and things like that. But I'm inspired by the way he used his academic abilities to speak to the rest of the world, and not just to other scholars, because he could have spent his whole life writing just academic books, and probably could have done that really well, and maybe been promoted at Oxford. And I do think that it's extremely challenging to take complex ideas and write them in a clear, straightforward form for the lay reader, and so I think he is a master at that, and someone to even see as an exemplar if you want to write in that same way, because he just doesn't water down the ideas, but he presents them in a way that the average reader can understand them. So thank you for that. Okay, so looking at your handout, I have sort of 3 topics that I want to cover tonight. First, and kind of briefly, imagination as the organ of meaning, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, although I think it will there will be a fuller expansiveness on that next week when we talk about Narnia. Secondly, his idea of the imagination as a teacher, and what he calls an opener of minds, and then thirdly, his idea of joy and glory, and what the baptized imagination is like. So starting off with our first topic, I'm going to read this quote. He says, reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. Imagination producing new metaphors or revivifying old is not the cause of truth, but its condition. All our truth, or all but a few fragments, is won by metaphor. And thence, I confess, it does follow that if our thinking is ever true, then the metaphors by which we think must have been good metaphors. So it's really interesting here. As I said before, he struggled with having this, and I really empathize with this, having a rational side to himself and a poetic side, and not always knowing how to bring the two together. And so here he sort of explains what he thinks both do, and I think he thinks they both need to work together. So he says reason is the organ of truth, and imagination is the organ of meaning. And what he means by that is that reason ascertains whether things are factual or not, whether they're falsehoods or truths. But the problem is that it's not enough to know a truth, and I actually find this all the time when I teach my students. I teach medieval history to them and medieval literature, and if I just recite fact after fact after fact about the 100 Years' War to them, for instance, they sit with these sort of blank expressions. They'll be doodling. They'll be looking off into space. They're receiving true facts from me, but it's not hitting their heart. The truth's not sinking into their bones. And so what I always have to do is I have to tell stories. Tell stories of all the rats that supposedly spread the plague, although they didn't. It was the fleas on the rats, which they love. Actually had a student write a story of the Black Plague from the perspective of the rat, which is just fantastic. But you start doing that using accessing their imagination, giving them images in their mind, and suddenly the true things, the facts, start to come alive and really sort of fill their bones and marrow, and so it's like putting flesh on a skeleton to a certain extent. And this really is, I think, why he does apologetics the way that he does. So apologetics is just defending the faith, and so some philosophers, to defend the faith, they just set up argument after argument after argument after argument, and they look at objections and they respond to those objections, and they try to be as mathematical and logical as possible, and that doesn't often convince very many people. It isn't a matter of sitting down and reading a logical equation and then all of a sudden, oh, well, I believe Christ is my personal Lord and Savior. It doesn't often happen that way. Not that it's not useful, not that it doesn't need to be done, and not even that Lewis doesn't do it, but for most of his books, he uses a great deal of images, to convey the truths and the arguments that he wants to get across. So, how many of you have read The Great Divorce? Okay, awesome. Yeah, it's so good. And I remember I read this as a 7th grader. So one of the things that he does in that just totally changed my mind, my imagination as a 7th grader, was the way he depicts this new world that they're encountering, which is supposed to be more like heaven or the New Jerusalem. And we have this, evangelicals, and not just evangelicals, the whole Western tradition has this Gnostic tendency or temptation to think of heaven as not bodily, as sort of airy, floating around in the sky. And that's actually not really biblical. It's not, it's much more close to Plato than it is to the Bible's idea of the resurrected body. And so I think that I kind of had an image of floating around in the clouds as being what heaven would be like before I read The Great Divorce. And in that, he actually has the people who have not yet converted, they are airy. They are sort of light. They could almost float off the ground. And when they encounter this new world that's supposed to be more like heaven, it's hard. So like I remember really being taken by the fact that he describes the grass as being spiky. Like you walk on it and it's painful to walk on if you're not adjusted to this world. And so it's not that the more you get close to God, the less bodily you become, but the closer you get to God, the more this sort of resurrected body and this sort of fullness is there. And that for me just transformed even my view of Christ as being in the flesh, taking on the flesh and being fully God and fully man. So he does this all the time. He also has a great chapter in The Great Divorce on he's trying to talk about idolatry and loving people the wrong way. And he has a whole chapter on a possessive mother. And as a mother, it's just so good to read. But she is so attached to her son and controlling his life that if he is in hell, she would rather be there in hell with him, helping his soul, than go to heaven. Given the two choices. So there's this sort of unhealthy attachment to him that always controls the way that she loves him and the way she loves others, the way she loves God. And so when I think of the reason or fact we shouldn't love our children idolatrously, that helps me to a certain extent. But when I think of the possessive mother in The Great Divorce, I think, I do not want to become that. So this is what he thinks imagination is capable of doing. It's interesting because in one of his letters in Yours, Jack, he says that he tends to think of the spirit or self as more of the reason and willing part of us, especially the willing part, the part that makes a choice. And then what he calls the soulish part, he says, is the imagination and the emotions. So that's a little bit of a sort of look into his idea of the human person, and he works out how a few scriptures he thinks sort of correspond to that. Although he says he doesn't think the scriptures are neat and clean on that distinction. So it's not that the imagination is the sole primary guardian of everything. Reason and will sort of have this guiding force, but imagination brings things to life. And this actually even reminds me to a certain extent of Heidegger's notion of truth. He says that it's like truth is like uncovering versus falsehood is like covering over. And he says you can actually say a list of true facts about something and have covered over more truth than you've revealed. So for instance, with God, you could give a list of God's sort of severe characteristics only, and list all of the seemingly atrocious things that he does in the Old Testament, and and all of these are true facts that you've listed. There's nothing untrue if you're thinking in these terms about it, but you've actually covered over more of an understanding of who he is, the meaning behind it, then you have revealed. And so Lewis thinks that without this idea of imagination or meaning, you're kind of missing what the facts or the truth are supposed to do for us. And I think art, visual paintings, poetry, that kind of thing, is one of the ways that we bring meaning, reveal the meaning of the truth and of the facts. You don't really get bare facts when you look at a Monet painting of the water lilies. You get the meaning of the light as it hits it, all of the different colors, all the beauty that's involved in it, and he sort of kind of teaches you how to experience things in a meaningful way, versus as I'm visiting a pond. That was a nice pond, and I will go off and do my thing. So, any questions before we keep going to the next part? Okay, so imagination as teacher and opener of minds. So our first quote comes from a really excellent essay that is I read for the first time these past 2 weeks, and I want to buy it now. I just read excerpts online. Called An Experiment in Criticism. So he says, we seek an enlargement of our being. We want to be more than ourselves. Each of us by nature sees the whole world from one point of view with a perspective and a selectiveness peculiar to himself. And even when we build disinterested fantasies, they are saturated with and limited by our own psychology. To acquiesce in this particularity on the sensuous level, in other words, not to discount perspective, would be lunacy. But we want to see with other eyes, to imagine with other imaginations, to feel with other hearts, as well as with our own. We demand windows. Literature as logos is a series of windows, even of doors. One of the things we feel after reading a great work is, I have got out. Or, from another point of view, I have got in. Pierced the shell of some other monad and discovered what it is like inside. So for Lewis, the imagination is not, and it's interesting because we kind of sometimes think of people that daydream, that go into their imaginations a lot, as very self-involved, sort of like navel gazers or something. And he says that if it's being used that way, it's actually being used in the opposite way that it's meant to. He thinks it's meant to actually take us out of ourselves, to allow us to understand people better than we would otherwise, to love people better, to see things from a different perspective of the world. So when my daughter reads Robinson Crusoe, she is learning not what it's like to be a fourth grader in Houston, Texas, but what it's like to be stranded on an island and around this drunken person that wants treasure all the time. You should hear her descriptions of it. But it's so she's learning about a new point of view, a different point of view, and he has this interesting thing where he's saying it's a window that allows you to get out, but he also says it allows you in another way to get in. And I think that once you have these sort of encounters with truth from different perspectives, it's like you realize you've been in a closet for a long time, and you've finally gone out into a room or even out of a house into a wide open world. And so in one sense, you've gotten out of the closet, but then in another sort of more glorious sense, you've gotten in to this large, expansive universe. And so your world just grows bigger. And I remember feeling this way when I started reading classics. I remember when I went to college and just realized that I hadn't been given any classics as a kid, and that they existed, and that they were also different and from different countries and different time periods, and started reading them. It was like every book I read, my world got bigger. And interestingly, because I was at a Christian college and my professors were strong believers, it also made me feel like my faith was the thing that was expanding everything. That my faith was sort of the organ for that expanse. Because when I read each thing, the worldview that I was sort of reading it from was one that was saying all truth is God's truth. So each of these things is part of something God's created, and God's created a lot more meaning than you realized before. So I love this idea of the imagination being like a window, and it's true for children when you read them books. If you ever read books to little faces with their big eyes and they're like hanging on every word. I was actually just reading, my 6th graders still love me to read them picture books. They just sit down on my feet and are ready for story time. And I read them a picture book on Francis of Assisi today, and they're just hanging. I think Hannah experienced that book last year, and they just were hanging on every word and oohing and ahhing, and it was just fantastic. I mean, they were living through this experience, and it was like they were being given a window out of something that was smaller that they had been in to see a bigger world. And that's actually the way you sort of cultivate your children's imagination, is you give them these little clues on how to do that. And each time they re-enter life after hearing that story, it's like it's been added to their whole picture of the universe. Any comments on that? Yeah.
One of the things I think we deal with a lot in Christian devotion and everything is application.
Mm-hmm.
We love application. Application's great. I love it too. But I think one of the things C.S. Lewis is saying in imagination is it actually gets us out of ourselves entirely.
Mm-hmm.
We're not worried about applying St. Francis of Assisi to our lives.
Mm-hmm.
We'll find application later, but right now we're just enjoying Francis.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things I think classical education has a strong point. But any good education, whoa, that's so cool. I have no idea how it applies to anything. It's so cool.
Yeah.
And I think in Christian devotion, we often are looking for application all the time. It's not about application to our lives.
Yeah. So that's actually a perfect segue to this next quote, because what he says is that when we encounter a work of art, or encounter a book or encounter the Bible, if we're doing it merely for pleasure, like I want to read this so I can have a not boring evening but a fun evening, or I'm reading this so I can get a spiritual high, or I'm reading this so I can get some more facts on this historical time period. He says that we're actually still sort of staying in this kind of possessor mode of the way that we encounter the work of art or the book, and we're not allowing it to speak to us in this sort of really full way, this kind of self-surrendering way. And he says, just like when you love another person, you stop seeing them as a means to your own end. In the same way, when you encounter a book or the scriptures or a work of art, if you encounter it with this sort of intention of love, of taking you out of yourself for a little while, you're actually going to be able to love the things that it's pointing to and see way more than you would see otherwise. And this is why things like Cliff Notes and Spark Notes bother me when they're replaced for the thing, because imagine reading a summary of the Psalms versus reading the Psalms. Sure, you might know the themes that were covered, but your heart won't have been impacted by them, and so like even application at that point is going to come later. It isn't just how can I read this and have things to apply to my life, but you read it and you stop, and it just hits you. Period. You just let it hit you. And then all those other good things like application, increase in faith, pleasure, all those things follow, but that isn't, you're not reading it for that as the primary end or goal. And I think artists want people to view their art in the same way, not just as sort of like 5 minutes of entertainment, but as something that they sit and take in. So this next quote, he says, "In love, we escape from ourself into another. The primary impulse of each is to maintain and aggrandize himself. The secondary impulse is to go out of the self, to correct its provincialism and heal its loneliness. In love, in virtue, in the pursuit of knowledge, and in the reception of the arts, we are doing this. Obviously, this process can be described either as an enlargement or as a temporary annihilation of the self, but that is an old paradox. He that loseth his life shall save it. I just love that. I love that for him, there's this idea of dying to self, of sort of setting the ego aside for a little while, that is all about the imagination and sort of encountering art, encountering books that allow you to love better. By learning to sort of go out of yourself when you encounter them. I had this assignment that I had my 6th graders do 3 years ago for their field trip, and at first they complained, and then afterwards they loved it, and I was like, yes. But we went to the Museum of Fine Arts, and I had them do a bunch of preliminary research on some of the works of art there, but they had to choose one painting and sit in front of that one painting for an hour. Which, for a 6th grader, oh my goodness, super hard. For most of us. So one painting for 1 hour, and then to write an essay on what they discovered about it. And you know, these essays were fantastic. And it was interesting. They even told me through the essays, well, I was really unhappy at first, and I was looking around and hoping, when is this going to be over? And eventually I started to see this and this and this, and this pointed to this, and it connected to my faith in this way. And I want to know about all the works of art by this artist. And then when the time was up, I thought I could be here for another hour. And I mean, as a teacher, I just was like, I want to cry. But that's the kind of thing that I think Lewis is saying when we use the imagination appropriately or properly. That's what happens. We encounter it in this sort of full way. We let it do what it's going to do to us. We give it time to do that. We're not sort of scrolling through picture after picture after picture after picture. We're letting one sort of do what it's going to do and giving it the time to do it. And you can imagine in a culture where people scroll through pictures, like on Pinterest and stuff. We've mentioned Pinterest before, and I'm not opposed to it at all. But you can imagine the challenge an artist has in grabbing people's attention when that's the culture. Because really, what they're looking for is something that's going to hit them for 5 seconds, maybe 10 seconds, and then share with a friend, and then go to the next thing. And what you want is you want them to sit with it. You want it to do something to them on a secondary and a third and a fourth level. And how do you do that? How do you create something without sort of just doing the shocking thing? Something as shocking as you possibly can, which I think is what a lot of people do. There's still, I don't know if it's still there, but at the Menil, there's like a piece of cheese with hair growing out of it as like one of the as one of the art exhibits, and I just think, wow, they really wanted people to stay more than 5 seconds. But what was the cost of that? Maybe not worth it. So so going on to this next quote, he says, "Those of us who have been true readers all our life seldom fully realize the enormous extension of our being which we owe to authors." And I would say that extends to artists and musicians and anyone who creates art. We realize it best when we talk with an unliterary, or we could say unartistic friend. He may be full of goodness and good sense, but he inhabits a tiny world. In it we should be suffocated. The man who is contented to be only himself, and therefore less a self, is in prison. My own eyes are not enough for me. I will see through the eyes of others. Reality, even seen through the eyes of many, is not enough. I will see what others have invented. I regret that the brutes cannot write books. Very gladly would I learn what face things present to a mouse or a bee. More gladly still would I perceive the olfactory world charged with all the information and emotion it carries for a dog. But in reading great literature, I become 1,000 men and yet remain myself. Like the night sky in the Greek poem, I see with a myriad eyes. But it is still I who see. Here, as in worship, in love, in moral action, in knowing, I transcend myself and am never more myself than when I do. I don't know about you, but I've had so many experiences of meeting someone, maybe even for the first time, and I'm a nerd, so like pretty early in, I'll ask them what their favorite books are, or what did they. Now that I'm a mom, I'll ask, what did you read to your children? Or what books were read to you as a child? What were your favorites? And when we find a book that we both read and loved, there's ones like Bridge to Terabithia and the Narnia books. There's now my daughter is all on Ramona Quimby, Judy Blume books, which are fantastic. But you find another person that has inhabited those worlds, and it's just so exciting. It's so exciting, and there's something so big and grand about it. And there's something that happens actually in sharing a thing that is good, that doesn't just happen when you hold it by yourself. And this is why I think imagination really is a taking yourself out of yourself, because it's when it's shared with another person that it's really savored, and that it becomes this thing that they respond to in one way, you respond to in another way. And I'm sure you all have had this experience with reading the scriptures in community. You read one parable and you think it has one meaning, and you realize, no, like maybe 20, or possibly more. None of them contradicting each other, but all of them like just layers and layers and layers that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. So he thinks that this is really important. And I do think that it's tempting for us to keep ourselves mostly seeing things that are recent, and not things that have been great across time. There's just this thing where, the Newbery Book Awards for kids, at least, it's always the books written in the last year only. And that's the books that you get points for reading and get a pizza party for and that kind of thing. And New York Times bestsellers, only books written in the last year or recently. And the books that NPR will interview the author about, they were books written in the last 20, 30 years. So, and things that are mentioned on Facebook and Twitter, they're often sort of the latest, greatest thing that's out. And I do think that he is making a point that like seeing through the eyes of others means also seeing with the eyes of others across time. And across landscapes too. Reading not just Augustine, who is a Western Church father, but Chrysostom, who is an Eastern Church father. It's fantastic to read both of their commentaries on the Gospel of John side by side, because you just see these different things that are illuminated that come out of each one a Latin and one a Greek, and your sort of experience of the richness of the scriptures has grown tremendously. So I think it's good. He recommends for every new book you read to read one old book, and he says if that's too hard, that for every new book you read, every 2 new books you read, to read one old book. And my daughters actually have this rule, like in our house, which sometimes they hate it, sometimes they love it, but they have to, for every live author they read, they have to read one dead author. So we have a pile of dead author books in our house that Claire and Annalise get to choose from after they've read their live author. And at first it's like a little hard, but now it's just, now they know what these books have done, and that's like some of their favorites. So I think that just sort of dipping in those waters, and as adults, you can be tempted to not keep challenging yourself. So dipping in those waters is a really good thing to keep doing. So last quote before the next section, he says, "Those who have prided themselves on being literal and who have endeavored to speak plainly with no mystical tomfoolery about the highest abstractions will be found to be among the least significant of writers. I doubt if we shall find more than a beggarly 5% of meaning in the pages of some celebrated tough-minded thinkers, but open your Plato and you will find yourself among the great creators of metaphor, and therefore among the masters of meaning." So he isn't trying to say that a scientific essay on a new discovery isn't fantastic, isn't something that's important to read. But he is saying that the writers that include the poetic and the imagination in their descriptions and in their delivery of the things that they're talking about are going to contain more meaning than the ones that only use a sort of long list of facts or bullet points. And he has this really interesting comparison that he gives, and after I had already put the handout together, I found these and I kind of wished I had put it on there, but he has this distinction he makes between, and I'm going to erase this, what he calls the pupils metaphor and the teacher's metaphor. This completely blew my mind. So it's two ways of coming up with metaphors that he thinks that we do. And just listen to his description. So pupils metaphor. He says, and this isn't on your handout, sorry, I wish it was. It may be that when we are trying to express clearly to ourselves or to others a conception which we have never perfectly understood, a new metaphor simply starts forth under the pressure of composition or argument. When this happens, the result is often as surprising and illuminating to us as to our audience. And I am inclined to think that this is what happens with the great new metaphors of the poets. And when it does happen, it is plain that our new understanding is bound up with the new metaphor. So this type of metaphor, he's saying, is something, and this happens to me all the time, where the meaning that you're trying to get at, it's swarming around in your head. All of the facts seem to only sort of lightly connect together. You can't quite figure out how to make it work. And as your brain is sort of reaching out for something to hang these things on, you come up with, it's just like such and such. And the moment that you do that, you suddenly, like, those things stop swarming for a little while. They stop swarming, and you have this sort of handle on a truth that you didn't quite get before. And so the process of coming up with the metaphor is actually a process of discovering truth. And he says this is sort of coming up with metaphors as a way of learning. It's something we discover just in the way we think. Often I think when you're trying to explain something to someone, well, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. So it's a way of sort of trying to understand. I don't know how many of us practice this regularly. Just the idea of I'm trying to reach out toward this truth that's mysterious, for instance, the Trinity, and in order to make my mind sort of reach a little further, what metaphors can I think of to make sense of it? And they're always going to be sort of, they're going to fall apart at some point, but they might get you a little bit closer. And so Lewis thinks this is a really, really important activity of the imagination that certain people do extremely well, others not as well, but that we all should do on a regular basis when we're trying to get at things, that we can get at them in a deeper way if we let our minds sort of go that direction. So then the teacher's metaphor, this is interesting too, since I'm a teacher and a mom. These are metaphors, he says, that we invent in order to teach other people. Okay, so he says when we are trying to explain to someone younger or less instructed than ourselves a matter which is already perfectly clear in our own minds. I don't know if anything is ever perfectly clear in my mind, but clear in a certain sense. We may deliberately and even painfully pitch about for the metaphor that is likely to help him. Now, when this happens, it is quite plain that our thought, our power of meaning, is not much helped or hindered by the metaphor that we use. On the contrary, we are often acutely aware of the discrepancy between our meaning and our image. We know that our metaphor is in some respects misleading, and probably if we acquired the tutorial shuffle, we would warn our audience that it is not to be pressed. So this type of metaphor is one, and if you're a parent, you've done it. Like countless times. When you're trying to explain something that's difficult to someone, this happens with my daughters, and you have to somehow you come up with a metaphor that gets at this thing that you know that their mind isn't totally ready for, but it can reach further than it's reaching right now. And he says that kind of metaphor is one that isn't necessarily always going to help the teacher know it any more clearly. I don't know if that's always true, because I actually find that in the process of teaching, I start understanding things in a much more deep way. But he said that as opposed to this one where you're reaching towards something and you're getting closer to something high, in this there's actually, in the teacher's metaphor, there's actually a somewhat of a pain in knowing that you're just not doing justice to it ever. Like you just always know all of the objections to your metaphor are running through your head, and you're not sure if to let it out of your mouth, but you need to just say something, or else you're just left with nothing. And sometimes you are left with nothing. This happens to me whenever I try to explain the Trinity to my kids. And they ask me all the time. And no matter what metaphor I come up with, I'm like almost cringing underneath, because I know like this is so unbiblical in this way and this way and this way, but like it's the only way that I can sort of get it out. And so he thinks that, but he thinks both of these metaphors are ways that we have of understanding the world. And of receiving understanding from other people. And he also thinks it's actually really great to try to find people that do this well and learn from them. Because they can give you metaphors that can help your mind reach beyond this place that it's sort of stuck at. And that sort of a mastermind knows how to create that bridge. And he thinks that all metaphors lie somewhere between these two extremes. He thinks these are two ends of a continuum, and metaphors sort of lie somewhere in between them, either closer to the teacher's metaphor or closer to the pupil's. Yeah.
Which writing does that come from?
This comes from an essay called, it's a very strange name. Let's see. I have it on the first page. Blue Spells and Philanthiers from Selected Literary Essays. It actually is, it is available online.
Okay.
It's fantastic. It blew my mind. Yeah. Yeah. They all do. But you still, here's the problem. They all fall apart, but when your 3-year-old asks about it, you still give them one. You know,
the most popular ones that want about water.
Yeah.
But they all can't exist at the same time.
They can't at the same time. Right. And then there's the triangle where God's in the middle, and there's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And what is that one?
Partialism.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It's in your cartoons.
Oh, really?
It's got all of them.
Interesting.
Modalism, partialism.
Okay. Wow.
And it's Irish comics.
That's fantastic. Okay, I need to look these up. That's great. It would have helped me in some mother moments.
I was really excited that somebody brought up Voltron. Thinking about it all night.
Wow.
C.S. Lewis lecture.
Yeah, no, it is. Yeah. That's awesome. Okay. So, yeah, any comments on that before we move to the next section? I love this. This is like is so insightful to me. Yeah.
Before I started paying attention to the imagination and its role in how God uses my imagination to get to me in Scripture, there's a reason why this stuff is important. There's a reason why Christ chose parables instead of just repeating, lists of to-dos and do's and don't do's.
Yeah.
There's something. It's very natural to a human mind to soak up a story, whereas the list, if you pinned me down, could I name all 10 commandments? I don't know, but I could get a lot of the parables pretty spot on. Some good friends of ours have a 3-year-old, and at night she wants to hear a story. She doesn't say, "Mom, tell me some facts." And so this is but in my, I guess the evangelical education, I just never paid attention to the role imagination plays in hope. We don't put, hope is is based on facts, and yet there's a leap, and that leap is the imagination. And so it's I don't know. In my own personal theology, has been a neglected part, and so I think it's very important to talk about.
That's fantastic. No, I just even the fact that there are 4 gospels instead of 1, that we have 4 different versions of Jesus's life, when it would have been, very straightforward and factual to give us 1, and maybe to choose Luke, who's the doctor, and lays it all out. But then we wouldn't get Matthew, then we wouldn't get John, and they each, and Mark, and they each do their own special thing. But it is this sort of imagination, meaning sort of level of the scriptures, which God chose and chose for a reason. And it. There's a reason why reading through Leviticus is a little harder than reading through the Gospel of John. So
Connected to one of the things you did as an exercise, sitting in front of the painting, that Jesus says the purpose of parables is not to accelerate learning, but to slow it down.
wow.
And he says that I speak in parables that they seeing, can't see, hearing. And it's an encryption model which says you can't think you've got it, and it's just exactly what you talked
Wow.
about, the truth versus meaning difference.
Yeah.
And so those that
Wow.
are quick to say what's your position on something, he's like, I'm not going to give you that
Right.
because you'll attach it to another narrative.
Right.
But if I give you a puzzle,
Yeah. And
you
then
enter into a different world.
you do. It's so interesting that in that scripture he also says that those who don't want to see will be more confused than they were initially. They even maybe thought they got it, and after the parable, it hasn't been clarified. It's actually been made more muddy, and so somehow their own state of their heart becomes a determination for whether they see the meaning in it or not, which is just amazing. So, and that connects to the imagination. So good. Okay. Any other comments? Okay. This part is. I don't want to miss this last part. So, for Lewis's conversion, one of the things that happened to him was he had to make 2 things come together, and those 2 things. And it sort of goes with what we've already sort of talked about, but fact and myth. So the historical and sort of the eternal, in a sense, eternal meaning. So myths tell stories. They have universal truths that they convey, and facts and history also tell stories, but it's a sort of lineup of exactly what happened, and whether it happened matters. Often in myths, whether it happened or not doesn't matter. And Lewis is dealing with an age where people were sort of reading the scriptures one way or the other, but not with the 2 together. So they were either researching the archaeological evidence, whether this was actually in the original manuscripts, whether he could have said this or not. And so whether it happened or not, the sort of scientific redactionary criticism of the Bible, like whether it happened or not, was sort of key to knowing whether we should believe it. And then there's this other side of the biblical critics, the more liberal sort of version, where it doesn't matter whether it happened or not. It's just such a good meaning. You learn about all of Jesus' teachings, about how to live a good life. There's a meaning of a God dying, and that in itself is important. And so it works. We don't have to worry about whether it happened or not, as long as the meaning in it is conveyed. And so Lewis said that before he converted, he was in the spot where he didn't really have a reason for not just making Christianity one of many of the myths that he thought were really important and meaningful. He had read, he loved Norse mythology and Greek mythology, and there were stories of dying gods in them. And so he didn't really understand why it was worth it picking this one as being superior to any of the other ones. And this is one of the things that his conversation with Tolkien helped him so much with. And what Tolkien, and he sort of, and then Lewis writes an essay later called Myth Became Fact, where he shows that all of the pagan myths can actually be seen as prefigurations of the Christian story. That all of them have, because we're made in God's image, whether we're believers or not, we have these inklings and these inklings. We have these sort of different aspects of the truth that we can get at, and these stories are ways of getting at them. And so by reading these stories, we get sort of ready to understand the grand story, the real story that sort of encapsulates all of them. So that was one of the things that helped him, is just he didn't have to throw away all of his Norse and Greek mythology that he loved so much. He could see them as having actually a positive role in prefiguring the Christian narrative. The other thing, though, that was key is that the meaning of the gospel narrative requires the factualness of it. So there isn't a way to understand God dying for our sins and that mattering unless it actually happened. If it didn't happen, then it's a story, but it loses its actual meaning. So it's kind of like saying to someone, if you pray a lot, then you'll live 10 years longer, and studies show that, so you should pray every night. But if you're praying so you'll live longer, then you've lost the meaning of prayer altogether. So whether you actually believe it's true ends up mattering essentially to the activity itself. And so that's what Lewis came to see was true about the Christian story that wasn't true about the other myths that he read, that in order to even embrace the meaning, you had to believe that it actually happened. And so that's one thing that happened when he says his imagination and his reason and his heart were baptized, is that first of all, he was able to see the earlier myths that he loved as being prefigurations, not as something to just throw away, but as something sort of connected in a way almost accidentally. And then secondly, as myth and fact actually going together in this really beautiful way, in the way that God is both fully man and fully God, the gospel narrative is fully fact and fully myth. Myth meaning story. Does that make sense? So our first quote on this handout says, "The heart of Christianity is a myth, which is also a fact. The old myth of the dying God, without ceasing to be myth, comes down from heaven of legend and imagination to the earth of history. It happens at a particular date, in a particular place, followed by definable historical consequences. We pass from a Balder or an Osiris, dying nobody knows when or where, to a historical person crucified. It is all in order, under Pontius Pilate. By becoming fact, it does not cease to be myth. That is the miracle." And that comes from his essay, Myth Became Fact. I think that a lot of biblical scholars err on the side of overemphasizing the factual historical way of reading the scriptures, or overemphasizing the story, universal truths aspect of reading the scriptures. And I think that you have to have those sort of essentially blended together in order to really get at what's important. And in a certain way, I think this connects to even the way to use the imagination rightly. So the imagination can get at eternal truths through metaphors, but if we don't then take that and change the way we actually live in our day-to-day historical life, then it hasn't transformed us. It hasn't done what it's supposed to do. So we can let our minds, our imaginations reach toward these stories, reach towards these metaphors, reach toward these eternal truths. But if in the facts of daily life we don't love our families better, love the Lord more than anything else, submit all those other things to Him, then this is sort of ceasing to have the power that it's supposed to. But we can't expect to be doers without being hearers. So being a doer without a hearer is like the facts without receiving the stories and the eternal. Okay, so last point. We have 10 minutes. Maybe the best one. I'm not sure. So Lewis has this concept of joy that this was revolutionary for me in understanding, because he was describing something I'd experienced, but I didn't know what it was. So when he was very young, he had a couple of experiences that impacted him profoundly and gave him what he would describe later as joy and as this sort of taste of heaven. That it was almost like it was a waking up, but it was unlike anything he had ever encountered before, and just sort of, it was almost like the process of falling in love or something, but it sort of lingered there. And so this first quote describes the first experience of that as a boy. He says, "Once in those very early days, my brother brought into the nursery the lid of a biscuit tin, which he had covered with moss and garnished with twigs and flowers so as to make it a toy garden or a toy forest. That was the first beauty I ever knew. What the real garden had failed to do, the toy garden did. It made me aware of nature, not indeed as a storehouse of forms and colors, but as something cool, dewy, fresh, exuberant. As long as I live, my imagination of paradise will retain something of my brother's toy garden." So this is such a small thing. I don't know exactly. I don't know how artistic his brother was, but I imagine it being something like a little world that you make in a shoebox. That you just sort of open up the shoebox and you have sticks and wood all sort of glued together in a specific way to make a little world. And when Lewis as a child encountered this, something really, a desire sort of hit him, a desire and a longing. And one of the characteristics of joy that he later comes to, or actually two of the characteristics that are kind of both together, both necessary, are a sort of a pleasure that is accompanied by a painful desire. Another way he says it is a having and wanting. So, and I've had this experience, and I think I described it when I gave the aesthetics lectures a year ago. When I go to really beautiful places, the mountains in Colorado, the hill country in Texas, my parents' ranch, I have this moment where I'm standing in front of, either an expanse of mountains or a creek with giant cypress trees sort of draping over it. And it's so incredibly beautiful, and I don't know what to do. I want to swallow it, maybe draw it. Do I climb all the trees that are in front of me? Do I run about? Do I bring my children there? Do I take 100 pictures, which I kind of want to? Just standing there, there's something. It's awakened a longing that is being satisfied and not satisfied at the same time. And it's such a strange feeling. So Lewis thinks that even though there's pain involved in that, it's actually what he calls joy. So you can liken it to, and he says that actually. Let me read this next quote because I think it'll get at it. He says, "The experience of joy is one of intense longing. In the first place, though the sense of want is acute and even painful, yet the mere wanting is felt to be somehow a delight. Other desires are felt as pleasures only if satisfaction is expected in the near future. Hunger is pleasant only while we know or believe that we are soon going to eat. But this desire, even when there is not hope of possible satisfaction, continues to be prized, and even to be preferred to anything else in the world by those who have once felt it. This hunger is better than any other fullness, this poverty better than all other wealth. In the second place, there is a peculiar mystery about the object of desire. If a man diligently followed this desire, pursuing the false objects until their falsity appeared, and then resolutely abandoning them, he must come out at last into the clear knowledge that the human soul was made to enjoy some object that is never fully given. nay, cannot even be imagined as given, in our present mode of subjective and spatio-temporal experience. And if nature makes nothing in vain, the one who can sit in this chair must exist. So this is actually sometimes called Lewis's argument for God's existence, being an argument from desire. And it basically goes as follows, that we have a desire that cannot be satisfied by anything on earth. That desire is there for a reason. Therefore, he who will fulfill that desire must exist beyond this world. But and that sort of goes with this experience of joy. But what he experienced at the time was this feeling of I love this, but I've just awoken a hunger that I didn't even know existed, and it's so overwhelming, and I don't know what to do with it. And what he does with this is so interesting and so I think helpful for us as like a warning for like 20 years or more. What he describes himself as doing is chasing after that feeling. That all he wants is to get that feeling that he had with his brother's toy garden again and again and again and again, and everything that he finds that delivers it, he like goes after it as much as he possibly can until it runs out, and then he moves on to another thing until it runs out. And he says that these feelings became rarer and rarer and rarer, and some of his disillusionment, even in his studies, like classical literature, did this with him for a while. But even after a while, classical literature didn't give him this feeling as many times that he had experienced. And what he came to see was that he was seeking after small objects with a lowercase o, that were actually meant to be signposts to point to the ultimate object with the capital O, which is God. And he was mistaking the created thing instead of going after the Creator, and was therefore in certain ways wanting to have or possess these created things in a really unhealthy way. In a way that distorted his love of them and really made him sort of using them, and they actually didn't deliver the pleasure anymore. And because he says that in certain ways, if you're going after a feeling instead of the object of the feeling, that the feeling starts to not come as much anymore. So if you're not going after God, these objects are going to stop delivering that in a matter of time, basically. And so what he says happens to him when he becomes a Christian is that he starts to hunger after the Lord, and in doing so, every time he has this little experience, this longing combined with a painful desire, he doesn't. It's like he's on a road in a wooded forest, and he, coming upon a flower that gives him that feeling. What he would have done before is sort of sat at the flower's feet and bowed down to it and tried to see everything that he could do to keep that feeling lasting as long as possible. What he says happens to him after he becomes a Christian is that he's on a road towards that object of joy, and this flower that he encounters on the way spurs that, but he's able to take it in and then keep going. It's a sign. It's a road sign on the way to the ultimate thing. And he says that ironically, he actually enjoys these signposts more than he was able to enjoy them before when he was making them the ultimate thing, because he's not asking them to be what they're not meant to be. And so this is something that's, I think, the imagination, when it's working at its best, I think, and the best aesthetic experiences are ones that awake that longing for God. And somehow don't make the person that encounters them worship the thing, but worship the thing that work is pointing to beyond itself. And that's I think a trickiness for any author or any artist, is not to make a person worship the work of art itself, but for their work to awaken something that then points beyond itself to the object that person really wants. So we are out of time. Let me end with this last quote, just because it's so good. He says, "Our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased."